On the morning of March 14, 1983, inside a windowless room on the fourth floor of the American Embassy in Vienna, a man named David Harmon sat alone with a cardboard box that would destroy everything he believed about love. The box had arrived 40 minutes earlier, delivered by a junior analyst from Langley who refused to make eye contact. Inside were 17 photographs, 3 audio cassettes, and a single manila folder stamped with red ink that read, "Eyes Only Counterintelligence Review." David had spent 19 years as a State Department officer. He had survived 2 postings in Moscow, a near kidnapping in Prague, and the slow erosion of idealism that comes from watching diplomacy fail over and over again. He thought he understood the cost of serving his country. He was wrong. The first photograph showed his wife Catherine sitting at a cafe table in East Berlin. The timestamp read November 1978, a month when she had told him she was visiting her sister in Connecticut. In the image, she was smiling at a man David did not recognize, a man with gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested military training. Their hands were touching across the table, but not in the way lovers touch. This was something else. This was the passing of information. David stared at the photograph for a long time. His coffee grew cold. The radiator clicked and hissed in the silence. He turned to the second photograph, then the third, then the 7th. Each one showed Catherine in a different city, on a different date, with different men he had never seen. Budapest, Warsaw, Leningrad. She appeared relaxed, confident, completely at ease in places where American wives were not supposed to go alone. In one image, she was carrying a leather briefcase that David recognized. He had given it to her for their 10th anniversary. The manila folder contained a single document, a photocopy of a Soviet internal passport. The photograph on the passport was Catherine's face, but the name beside it was not Catherine Harmon. It was Yekaterina Volkov. And according to the file, Yekaterina Volkov had been an officer of the first chief directorate of the KGB since 1962, 3 years before. She had walked into David's life at a diplomatic reception in Geneva. 3 years before, she had laughed at his nervous jokes. 3 years before, she had become his wife. David closed the folder. He pressed his palms flat against the table and tried to breathe. Outside, somewhere in the gray streets of Vienna, the world continued to move. Cars honked. Pedestrians hurried past embassy gates. A church bell rang in the distance. But inside that room, time had stopped. History had folded back on itself, and David Harmon was no longer certain who he was. He had loved her for 18 years. He had held her hand through 2 miscarriages. He had whispered secrets to her in the dark, not state secrets, not classified information, just the small truths that married people share when they trust each other completely. He had trusted her completely, and she had been reporting every word to Moscow. To understand what happened to David Harmon, you must first understand Vienna in 1983. The city sat at the precise intersection of 2 worlds, a neutral island floating in a sea of ideological warfare. To the east lay the Soviet Empire, hundreds of millions of people living behind walls of concrete and barbed wire, their letters opened, their phones tapped, their thoughts monitored by armies of informants. To the west lay the so-called free world, where democracy was celebrated in public speeches while intelligence agencies conducted their own shadow wars in the dark. Vienna was where these 2 worlds met to negotiate, to spy, and occasionally to exchange prisoners who had outlived their usefulness. The city's grand coffee houses, with their velvet chairs and crystal chandeliers, served as meeting points for diplomats, defectors, and double agents. Every waiter might be an informant. Every tourist might be carrying a camera designed in a laboratory in Moscow or Langley. Trust was a currency that no one could afford to spend. The Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase. Ronald Reagan had taken office 2 years earlier, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and launching the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Kremlin, led by the aging Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief who saw enemies everywhere, responded with a campaign of aggressive intelligence operations designed to penetrate every level of Western government. The nuclear arsenals on both sides had grown to the point of absurdity. Enough warheads to destroy human civilization several times over. Enough missiles to ensure that if one side launched, the other would have exactly 12 minutes to decide whether to end the world. In this atmosphere of paranoia and preparation for apocalypse, the men and women who staffed American embassies lived double lives of their own. They attended cocktail parties and cultural events, smiling at Soviet counterparts while secretly assessing who might be recruited, who might be turned, who might be willing to betray their country for money or ideology or simple human weakness. They knew their phones were tapped. They assumed their homes were bugged. They trained themselves to speak in code even when discussing dinner plans. David Harmon had accepted this reality decades ago. He had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the man who kissed his wife goodbye each morning from the man who spent his afternoons analyzing Soviet military movements and drafting cables about the intentions of men who might one day order his death. He believed this compartmentalization protected him. He believed it made him strong. What he had never considered, what no training had prepared him for, was the possibility that the compartmentalization was happening inside his own marriage. That the woman sleeping beside him each night was conducting her own analysis, drafting her own reports, serving her own masters. The KGB called these operations Romeo missions. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Identify a promising Western target. Insert an attractive agent into his life. Cultivate a relationship over months or years, and then harvest intelligence for as long as the deception could be maintained. The best Romeo agents were patient. They did not push. They did not ask suspicious questions. They simply listened, observed, and reported. They became perfect wives, perfect husbands, perfect lovers, and they destroyed their target so slowly that the damage was invisible until it was complete. Catherine, or rather Yekaterina, had been one of the best. David met her in Geneva in the spring of 1965. He was 29 years old, freshly assigned to the American delegation negotiating arms control agreements that everyone knew would never be honored. She was working as a translator for a Swiss cultural foundation, or so she claimed. Her English was flawless, with just enough accent to seem exotic. Her laugh was warm and genuine, or so it seemed. When she looked at him across the crowded reception hall, something in her eyes made him feel seen in a way he had never experienced before. They talked for 3 hours that first night. She asked about his childhood in Ohio, about his years at Yale, about his decision to join the Foreign Service instead of taking a comfortable job at his father's law firm. She remembered every detail. Weeks later, she would reference something he had mentioned in passing, a favorite book, a childhood memory, a half-formed dream, and he would feel a rush of warmth at the knowledge that she had been listening so carefully. What David did not know was that Yekaterina Volkov had been preparing for this meeting for 18 months. She had studied his personnel file, memorized his family history, analyzed his psychological profile. KGB assessors had identified him as a promising long-term target, intelligent, ambitious, emotionally reserved, likely to rise through the diplomatic ranks, and most importantly, lonely. He had never had a serious relationship. He poured himself into his work. He believed in his mission with the fervor of a true believer. The KGB knew that true believers were the easiest to deceive. They wanted so badly to trust that they ignored the warning signs. Their courtship lasted 8 months. Catherine, she had chosen the name herself. Anglicizing her Russian identity, moved from Geneva to Washington, taking a position at a small nonprofit that promoted cultural exchange between East and West. The organization was legitimate, though several of its board members maintained quiet connections to Soviet intelligence. She visited David on weekends. They went to museums, took long walks along the Potomac, talked about the future as if the future were something they could control. When David proposed, she cried. The tears were real. Even trained agents could not always control their physiological responses. But the emotion behind the tears was something more complex than love. It was relief, it was triumph, It was the knowledge that 18 months of preparation had finally paid off. That she had successfully inserted herself into the life of an American diplomat who might, one day, have access to the highest levels of his government. They married in a small ceremony in Virginia. Her parents could not attend, she explained, because they were elderly and could not travel. In truth, her parents were party members living in a cramped apartment in Leningrad, receiving monthly stipends from the state in exchange for their daughter's service to the motherland. David never questioned the story. Why would he? Catherine was everything he had ever wanted: intelligent, beautiful, supportive, endlessly interested in his work. She asked thoughtful questions about his day. She remembered the names of his colleagues. She knew exactly when to offer encouragement and when to remain silent. She was, in every measurable way, the perfect wife. And for 18 years she photographed his documents, recorded his phone calls, and transmitted everything to a handler she met twice a year in carefully choreographed encounters across neutral Europe. The damage was difficult to calculate. The CIA's counterintelligence division would spend months trying to assess what Catherine had compromised. David had never handled the most sensitive materials. He was a political officer, not an intelligence operative, but he had attended countless meetings, read countless cables, overheard countless conversations. He had brought work home. He had discussed policy options with colleagues at dinner parties, while Catherine served wine and smiled. He had trusted the security of his own home. Everything he had seen, she had seen. Everything he had heard, she had heard. Every negotiating position, every internal disagreement, every assessment of Soviet intentions, all of it had flowed through Catherine's elegant handwriting into reports that traveled from Vienna to Moscow to the desks of men who used the information to outmaneuver American diplomacy at every turn. But the intelligence damage was not what haunted David in the weeks after he opened that cardboard box. What haunted him was the memory of her hand on his face in the morning, the sound of her voice reading aloud from novels they both loved, the look in her eyes when she said she was proud of him. Had any of it been real? He would never know. That was the cruelest part of the deception. Catherine had been so skilled, so disciplined, so utterly convincing that David could not separate the performance from the person. Perhaps she had grown to care for him over the years. Such things happened, even to trained agents. Perhaps every tender moment had been calculated, rehearsed, reported to her superiors as evidence of her continued access. The truth was locked inside a mind he had never really known, and it would remain locked forever. 3 days after receiving the file, David was recalled to Washington for debriefing. The sessions lasted 6 weeks. He sat in windowless rooms, much like the one in Vienna, answering the same questions over and over while men in gray suits took notes and avoided his eyes. They wanted to know everything, every conversation, every trip, every moment when Catherine had been alone with his briefcase. They wanted to know about their intimate life, their arguments, their private jokes. Nothing was off limits. Nothing was sacred. David cooperated fully. He had no choice. But with each answer he felt another piece of himself disappear. The life he had built, the career, the marriage, the identity, was being disassembled by bureaucratic hands, catalogued and filed away as evidence of his failure to detect what should have been obvious. The men in gray suits never blamed him directly. They were careful about that. But David could see the judgment in their silences, in the way they glanced at each other when he described Catherine's warmth, her attentiveness, her uncanny ability to make him feel understood. "How could you not know?" their eyes seemed to ask. "How could you share a bed with a Soviet agent for 18 years and never once suspect?" David had no answer. He had been in love. And love, he was learning, was the most effective form of blindness ever invented. Catherine was arrested on April 2, 1983, at a safe house in suburban Maryland where she had been staying since David's recall. The FBI had been watching her for weeks, documenting her movements, intercepting her communications, building a case that would eventually fill 17 boxes of evidence. She did not resist when the agents arrived. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting them, and asked permission to retrieve a photograph from her bedroom before being taken into custody. The photograph was of David, taken on their honeymoon in Italy. In it, he was standing on a bridge in Venice, squinting into the afternoon sun, smiling with the unguarded joy of a man who believed his future was secure. She kept the photograph throughout her interrogation. The FBI agents noted this in their reports but could not explain its significance. Perhaps it was a prop, a tool designed to generate sympathy or confusion. Perhaps it was something else, a reminder of the life she had constructed, the man she had deceived, the years she had spent pretending to be someone she was not. Catherine Yekaterina never fully cooperated with her interrogators. She admitted to being a Soviet intelligence officer. She acknowledged that her marriage to David had been part of an operational assignment. But she refused to identify her handlers, refused to detail her methods, refused to explain how she had evaded detection for nearly 2 decades. She answered questions with questions. She smiled at accusations. She treated the entire process with the calm detachment of someone who had long ago accepted that this moment would eventually arrive. In October 1983, she was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. The trial was closed to the public for reasons of national security. David was not permitted to attend, though he requested permission twice. He wanted to see her one last time, to look into her eyes, and ask the question that had been consuming him since March. "Did you ever love me?" He never got the chance. The aftermath of a betrayal like this does not end with a conviction. It echoes through years, through careers, through every relationship that follows. David resigned from the State Department 3 months after Catherine's arrest. His superiors expressed regret. He had been a promising officer, they said, a man with a future, but everyone understood that his usefulness was over. He had been compromised in the most intimate way possible. No foreign government would ever trust him with sensitive information again. He moved to a small town in Vermont, far from Washington and its memories. He took a job teaching history at a community college, standing before students who had no idea that their professor had once attended briefings in the Situation Room, had once shaken hands with secretaries of state, had once believed he was helping to prevent nuclear war. He never remarried. He never spoke publicly about Catherine. When colleagues asked about his past, he offered vague answers about government service and changed the subject. The details were classified, he said, which was true. But the deeper truth was that he could not bear to explain. How do you tell someone that the greatest love of your life was a fiction? How do you admit that you were fooled so completely for so long by someone who knew exactly how to become everything you needed? David lived with these questions for 31 years. He read books about Cold War espionage, searching for cases similar to his own, trying to understand the psychology of agents like Catherine. He learned about other Romeo operations, other American officials destroyed by Soviet lovers who had been trained to deceive. He was not unique. He was not even unusual. The KGB had perfected this technique over decades, deploying beautiful women and charming men to infiltrate the lives of their enemies. But knowing this did not ease the pain. Each case he read about was someone else's story, someone else's broken heart. His own heart remained broken in ways that no historical analysis could repair. Catherine died in federal prison in 1997, 14 years into her sentence. The cause was listed as cardiac arrest, though some who followed her case suspected that the years of isolation had simply worn her down. She was 63 years old. She had spent more than a quarter of her life in a cell, separated from the country she had served, forgotten by the agency that had trained her. David learned of her death from a brief item in the Washington Post, buried on page 14 between an article about trade negotiations and an advertisement for furniture. The notice was only 3 sentences long. It did not mention her real name, her operational history, or the 18 years she had spent as his wife. It simply stated that a convicted Soviet spy had died in custody and that no services were planned. He read those 3 sentences 7 times. Then he folded the newspaper, placed it in a drawer, and did not look at it again for 9 years. What do you do with grief when the person you're grieving never really existed? David had asked himself this question every day since 1983, and he still had no answer. Catherine, the wife, had been a construction, a character played with extraordinary skill by a woman whose real thoughts and feelings remained forever hidden. But the memories were real. The laughter was real. The warmth of her body beside him on cold winter nights had been real. How do you mourn a ghost who left behind so much evidence of her presence? He mourned anyway. He could not help it. The heart does not negotiate with evidence. It feels what it feels, and David's heart had loved Catherine Harmon for 18 years. Regardless of what his mind now knew about Yekaterina Volkov, the betrayal did not erase the love. It simply poisoned it, transformed it into something that could neither be expressed nor forgotten. In the years after her death, David began to write. Not for publication. He had no desire to see his story sensationalized in newspapers or turned into a television movie. He wrote for himself, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to separate the woman he had known from the agent she had been. He filled notebook after notebook with memories, questions, fragments of conversations he could not verify. Had she really laughed at that joke, or had she been trained to laugh? Had she really cried at that film, or had tears been part of her operational toolkit? The notebooks piled up in his study, a private archive of a marriage that had been simultaneously real and fictional. He never showed them to anyone. They were not meant to be read. They were meant to be written. The act of putting words on paper was itself a form of survival, a way of processing pain that had no other outlet. The Cold War ended in 1991, but its shadows continued to fall across the lives of those who had lived through it. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly the great ideological struggle that had defined half a century was over. Young people celebrated in the streets of Moscow and Prague and Warsaw, believing that a new era of freedom and cooperation had begun. They did not know, could not know, how many lives had been destroyed in the decades before, how many marriages had been weapons, how many loves had been lies. David watched the celebrations on television from his small house in Vermont. He felt nothing. The end of the Cold War did not bring him peace. It did not restore what had been taken from him. It simply meant that the system which had created Catherine, which had trained her and deployed her and ultimately abandoned her, no longer existed. The KGB was dissolved. The first chief directorate was reorganized under new names. The men who had ordered the operation against David Harmon retired to dachas outside Moscow, living on state pensions, never held accountable for the lives they had ruined. This was the nature of intelligence work, David had come to understand. The victories were secret, the defeats were secret, and the human cost was never calculated. Agents like Catherine were tools, used until they broke and then discarded. Targets like David were collateral damage, acceptable losses in a war that neither side ever officially declared. There were no memorials for the casualties of espionage, no ceremonies honoring those who had been deceived. There was only silence and the private knowledge of what had been lost. Sometimes, late at night, David would take out the photograph that had been included in his file, the one showing Catherine in East Berlin, smiling at the gray-haired man across the cafe table. He would study her face, searching for some sign of the deception, some tell that he should have noticed. But her expression revealed nothing. She looked happy, relaxed, entirely natural. She looked like a woman meeting an old friend. Perhaps in some way she had been... The gray-haired man was almost certainly her handler, a KGB officer who had supervised her operation for years. He would have known her better than David ever did. He would have read her reports, approved her methods, guided her through the long deception. In the strange calculus of espionage, their relationship might have been the more honest one. Two professionals working toward a shared goal. Bound by duty rather than manufactured emotion. David hated him without knowing his name. He hated him for having access to the real Catherine, the woman behind the mask, the person who had chosen to dedicate her life to destroying American marriages from the inside. He hated him for knowing the truth while David had been left with nothing but questions. But hatred, like grief, eventually exhausts itself. The years passed, the notebooks filled. David grew old in his Vermont house, teaching fewer and fewer classes, spending more and more time alone with his memories. He developed the habits of a solitary man, precise mealtimes, long walks in the woods, evenings spent reading histories of a conflict that had shaped his entire life. He became, in his own way, an expert on the Cold War, though his expertise was not the kind that could be published or cited. It was personal, experiential, written in the language of loss. In 2006, 23 years after Catherine's arrest, David received an unexpected letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from New York City. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful English, signed with a name he did not recognize. The letter was from a woman named Irina Volkov. She identified herself as Catherine's niece, the daughter of a brother David had never known existed. She had grown up in St. Petersburg, the city formerly known as Leningrad, and had recently immigrated to the United States. She had spent years searching for information about her aunt, the family member who had disappeared into foreign service and never returned. And now she wanted to meet the man her aunt had married. David read the letter 3 times. His hands trembled slightly. For more than 2 decades, he had lived with the assumption that Catherine's past was sealed, inaccessible, lost behind the collapse of the Soviet system. And now, suddenly, a connection had appeared, a living person who might be able to answer the questions that had haunted him since 1983. He wrote back the same day. His response was cautious, measured, the product of years of diplomatic training. He acknowledged receiving her letter. He confirmed that he had been married to her aunt. He suggested that they might speak by telephone before deciding whether to meet in person. Irina called 2 weeks later. Her English was excellent, better than Catherine's had been, with barely a trace of accent. She explained that she had been 7 years old when her aunt left for the West. Too young to understand what was happening, too young to ask the questions that would only occur to her decades later. Her family had never spoken of Catherine, or Yekaterina, as Irina called her, except in whispers. And even those whispers had stopped after the arrest became known. The name had become unspeakable, a source of shame that the family had buried along with so much else from the Soviet era. But Irina had not forgotten. She had grown up curious about the aunt who had vanished, the woman whose photograph had been removed from family albums, whose existence had been erased from official records. When the Soviet Union collapsed and archives began to open, she had started searching. It took her 15 years to piece together enough information to find David Harmon, the American diplomat who had unknowingly married a KGB officer. David listened to her story without interrupting. When she finished, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he opened her letter. "Did she ever talk about me, before she left?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I was only 7, Irina said finally. "But I remember one thing. She came to visit us a few months before she went to Geneva. She sat with my grandmother in the kitchen, and they talked for a long time. I was supposed to be asleep, but I was listening through the door, and I heard my grandmother ask her if she was sure, if she really wanted to do this thing they were asking her to do, and my aunt said something I have never forgotten. David waited. She said, 'I will do what is required, but I hope he is kind. I hope, at least, that he is kind.'" They met in person 3 months later at a cafe in Manhattan. Irina was in her late 40s, with dark hair and a face that reminded David painfully of the woman he had married. They talked for 4 hours, sharing what they knew, trying to construct a picture of Catherine that neither of them could complete alone. Irina had brought documents, photocopies of records she had obtained from Russian archives, fragments of her aunt's early life that David had never known. Catherine had been recruited by the KGB at 19, identified as a promising candidate during her studies at Moscow State University. She had been trained for 3 years in languages, tradecraft, and the psychological manipulation of targets. Her instructors had noted her exceptional ability to adapt, to become whatever her environment required. She had graduated at the top of her class. The Geneva operation had been her first major assignment. David had been selected as her target based on careful analysis, his career trajectory, his personality profile, his emotional vulnerabilities. Everything that followed from their first conversation to their wedding to their 18 years together had been planned in offices thousands of miles away by people who would never know his name. And yet, Irina had also brought a letter, one that her grandmother had kept hidden for decades. Discovered only after the old woman's death in 2001, it was from Catherine. Written in Russian, dated 1979, 4 years before her arrest. The letter was short, less than a page, and Irina had translated it for David. "I am writing to tell you that I am well," the letter began. "I cannot say where I am or what I am doing, but I want you to know that I have found something I did not expect to find. I have found a good man. He does not know what I am, and he must never know, but he is kind to me in ways I do not deserve. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been if I had met him under different circumstances, if I had been someone else, if the world had been different. But the world is not different, and I am not someone else, and so I do what I was trained to do. Please do not write back. Please do not try to contact me. Just know that I'm thinking of you, and that I have not forgotten where I come from. Your loving niece, Katya." David held the translation in his hands for a long time. The cafe buzzed with conversation around him, but he heard nothing. The letter was not proof of love. It could have been another layer of deception, a performance for family members who might one day be interrogated. It could have been manipulation, sentiment manufactured for an audience. But it could also have been true. That was the hell of it. David would never know. The woman who could have told him was dead, her secrets buried with her in an unmarked grave somewhere in the American prison system. All that remained were fragments, a letter, a photograph, a niece who remembered a whispered conversation through a kitchen door. Pieces of a puzzle that could never be completed. David Harmon died in 2014 at the age of 78. He passed quietly in his Vermont home, surrounded by notebooks he had never shared and memories he had never fully processed. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his years of government service but said nothing about Catherine, nothing about Vienna, nothing about the cardboard box that had changed his life. A few of his former colleagues attended the funeral, men who had known him in the days before everything fell apart. They spoke of his dedication, his intelligence, his quiet dignity in the face of circumstances they could only imagine. None of them mentioned espionage. None of them mentioned betrayal. Some wounds are too deep to be discussed at funerals. Irina Volkov was there as well, standing at the back of the small church, a stranger among strangers. She had visited David twice more in the years since their first meeting, bringing him whatever scraps of information she could find about Catherine's past. Their relationship had become something neither of them could name. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but a bond forged by shared loss and unanswered questions. After the service, she approached the casket and placed something inside, a photograph of Catherine, the same one that had been found in her possession when she was arrested, the photograph of David on a bridge in Venice, squinting into the sun, smiling with the unguarded joy of a man who believed his future was secure. It seemed right, somehow, that they should be buried together, the image and the man, the deception and the deceived, the love that might have been real and the love that was certainly lost. The Cold War produced millions of stories like this one. Not all of them involved espionage. Not all of them involved betrayal. But all of them involved the fundamental tragedy of that era, the way ideology divided humanity into enemies, the way fear justified deception, the way systems consumed the individuals who served them. David Harmon was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was simply a man who fell in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time in history, and who spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that love had meant. He never found a satisfactory answer. Perhaps there was no answer to find. Perhaps some questions are designed to remain open, wounds that never fully heal, reminders of how much we risk when we allow ourselves to trust. The KGB operation that targeted him was considered a success by Soviet intelligence standards. Catherine provided valuable information for nearly 2 decades, contributing to Soviet negotiating advantages in arms control talks, helping Moscow anticipate American diplomatic positions, giving the Kremlin insight into the thinking of its primary adversary. By the cold calculus of espionage, the operation achieved its objectives. But calculus does not account for the human cost. It does not measure the nights David spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if his entire adult life had been a lie. It does not quantify the weight of photographs that show a stranger wearing his wife's face. It does not explain what it means to love someone who is trained to make you love her, or to grieve someone who may never have existed at all. These are the stories that history forgets. The great events of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, are remembered and analyzed and commemorated. But the private tragedies, the individual lives destroyed by forces beyond their control, fade into silence. They become footnotes, statistics, names, and classified files that will remain sealed for decades. David Harmon's name is in one of those files. So is Catherine's, both her names, the American fiction, and the Russian reality. Somewhere in an archive in Washington or Moscow, the full record of their story exists. The reports, the photographs, the transcripts, the assessments, bureaucratic evidence of a marriage that was also an operation, a love that was also a weapon. Perhaps someday those files will be opened. Perhaps historians will study them and draw conclusions about the nature of Cold War espionage, the psychology of deception, the limits of human perception. Perhaps they will write academic papers analyzing the Romeo technique, treating David and Catherine as case studies in a larger pattern of intelligence operations. But they will miss the point. The point is not the technique. The point is not the intelligence value. The point is that 2 human beings shared a life together, and one of them was lying the entire time, and the other one never recovered from the truth. That is the real legacy of the Cold War. Not the missiles or the treaties or the ideological battles, but the individual hearts that were broken in its service. The silent casualties who received no medals, no recognition, no compensation. The men and women who discovered, too late, that the people they loved were enemies in disguise. David Harmon was one of those casualties. Catherine Volkov, Yekaterina, Katya, whatever name she truly answered to, was another. They were both destroyed by a system that used human connection as a weapon, that turned intimacy into intelligence, that measured success in secrets stolen rather than lives preserved. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile trust really was during those years of shadow warfare, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Stories of love and betrayal and the terrible cost of living in a divided world. The file is closed now. The cardboard box has been sealed and stored in some government warehouse alongside thousands of others just like it. But the questions remain, echoing through the decades, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Did she ever love him? We will never know. And perhaps that is the cruelest weapon of all. Not the lies we discover, but the truths we can never confirm. The uncertainty that lingers long after the Cold War ended, long after the agents retired, long after the lovers died. Some wars never really end. They just move inside us, where they continue to fight in silence forever.